Rolling. You want to roll sound, please?
We're here?
Yep. All right, we're ready to go.
Okay. Alright. We just
Now
have.
you gotta remember, I'm hard of hearing, so,
Alright. Now, make them a little closer if you need.
and I'll be reading your lips too.
Okay,
I guess I
alright.
don't need these most of the time.
Okay. I have an introduction to read first.
Sure.
So, you have been selected to speak with us today because you have been identified as someone who has much to share about the subject of the 1979 strike at Clinton Corn Processing Company. We would like to record our conversations today. We also need you to sign a form devised to meet Augustana College's research requirements and 2 other forms to give the recording as a gift to the Clinton Public Library. Essentially, this document states that 1. Only the information that you are comfortable being used in the research will be used. 2. Your participation is voluntary and you may stop at any time if you feel uncomfortable. And 3. You may choose to remain anonymous if you wish. Otherwise, your name may be used in future presentations, publications, documentaries, and online material based on this research. Please sign the release forms after reading them if you agree to participate. After the reading has been transcribed and you have placed whatever restrictions you would like on that information will be released. Then the materials will be placed in the archives of the Clinton Public Library permanently. Thank you for agreeing to participate. We plan this interview to last no longer than an hour. During this period, we have several questions we would like you to cover. We do not foresee that any questions will make you uncomfortable, but please let us know if it does, and we can move to another topic. Please let us know if at any point you need to end the interview earlier, and we will shorten the interview. On the other hand, if time begins to run short, it may be necessary to interrupt you in order to push ahead and complete this line of questioning, or to come back for a follow-up interview. And my name is Ashlyn Young.
And my name is Karina de la Rosa.
Could you please state your name and spell it for the records?
Sure. I'm Charles H. Pelton, or Charles Howard Pelton. And you wanted my age too. I was born August 15th, 1940, before the Second World War started, in Clinton, Iowa.
Have you lived in Clinton, Iowa since then?
No. My father was transferred to New York City when Clinton Corn Processing Company was purchased by Standard Brands Incorporated. My father had been the chief chemical engineer and several other jobs there for many, many years. And he was taken by Standard Brands Incorporated and taken to the New York office in New York City, down on Madison Avenue, as their principal engineer. He, after a year or a little more, he hated it, hated the New York City. It was very difficult times in New York City. Had a lot of strikes, public service strikes, garbage strike, policemen, firemen, a lot of difficulties in the city. We lived 50 miles north of the city, or maybe not quite that far, maybe 40 miles north of the city. Had to commute by train, had transportation problems and strikes, all kinds of problems. And the final thing was they were loading nuclear weapons in the ships there in Manhattan. And when it was all disclosed, and my father said, I felt trapped the whole time. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. And so he quit. And they wouldn't let him quit. They brought him back here and made him assistant to the president of the local company here. But so I went to high school in New York, not in the city, up in Westchester County, my junior year, and loved every minute of it. I had a wonderful time. Went to Hendrick Hudson High School in Montrose, New York. But I had been in Clinton High School before that, and then my senior year at Clinton High School. That answer your question? Too much answer.
No, that makes sense.
And then, of course, I went to school forever
Oh.
after I graduated in 1958.
All right. Which year was it that you lived in New York?
Lived where?
When you were living in New York, what year did you move over?
It must have been about 56, 57. '87 time. I had a whole school year there.
All right. And then outside of that, you were living in Clinton?
Yes, until I
Before
went
that,
to
no.
Iowa City, and I was there for 8 years.
So what is your current city right now, and what is your present occupation?
My current occupation?
Yes.
I'm a lawyer in the private sector, doing mediation.
And
I did some things before that, but that's what I'm currently doing.
all right.
I resolve disputes between parties, typically civil cases, generally cases of significant amount of money, and anything from an automobile collision to a workers' compensation case, a workers' comp case, civil disputes, so often with an insurance company on the defense side defending somebody, a lot of employment law cases, a lot of cases, even cases, family-owned businesses and farm disputes in a family that the lawsuit's been filed often, but they really don't want to air all that in the public, and they'll hire me as a kind of a private judge to resolve the dispute for them and pay me pretty well for it. And I find it to be very, very interesting and very satisfying.
Do you think your experience in that occupation, in the context of the strike that we're discussing, do you think that it gives you a different sort of insight on the strike, the Clinton Corn Company strike of 70?
Well, I've only been a mediator in the private sector for 3 years. Maybe I should go back and tell you how I got started in life. I graduated from high school. I was 17 in Clinton Corn and at Clinton High School, and then went to the University of Iowa, and I was an engineering student, and you know, we had all those classes at 7:30 in the morning, and took lots of classes and went fast. I was a chemical engineering student, and my father expected me to be a chemical engineer. He had been, and I, by God, was going to be one too. And then something happened. A huge light bulb went off in my life. In my junior year in college, while I was in engineering, they required that I take 2 electives, and one of them I took was business law. And I found it fascinating. And the professor asked me to stay after the class when it was over. This can happen to you too, students, when you get off to college and all of a sudden you're in one area and all of a sudden a light bulb goes off and you think, oh my God, this is something I never knew anything about. And it's very interesting. And so the professor put his arm around me and walked me down the hall, and he said, young man, you should look at the law school. I didn't know what law school was, but I didn't know what lawyers did. They didn't have a very good reputation in my family, and I took the risk of telling my dad and I were doing the dishes one night after dinner. I was drying, he was washing, and I said, Dad, I'm thinking about going to law school. And he said, pounded his fist down on the table, and he says, the trouble with this country is there's too goddamn many lawyers. And it was downhill from there. And I went to law school anyway, and he incidentally became kind of an administrative, he kind of did administrative law for many years after he came back from New York. And so I went to law school, I practiced law, and I got out of law school. I got elected to the legislature. I ran for the legislature when I was still a senior in law school. I got elected. I represented Clinton County for 6 years. I was a moderate Republican and a kid. I was 26 years old. And I served in the legislature. I rose to be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee wrote or handled many, many of the laws that are on the books today in the legal area of the law, the courts, and everything from public sector collective bargaining to the present court system, to the dissolution of marriage, to the drug laws and so on. That are currently the law. Anyway.
Really fast. So when did you work in Clinton Company?
When did I
Corn
work
Clinton
there?
Company, yes.
Okay. I started working at Clinton Corn as soon as I turned 18, which would not have been, you see, the labor laws are such that you can't work in industry like that till you turn 18. And I hadn't turned 18 the summer after I graduated from high school, so I was still working somewhere else in a lumber, paint, and hardware store. And so after my first year in college, I would have started at Clinton Corn Processing Company. And then I worked there, I think, 6 consecutive summers. Every summer since would have been probably, 59? I graduated in 58, so I probably would have been in 59, and for 6 consecutive summers.
So what was your job during the 6 consecutive summers?
During the which?
What was your job when you were working in Clinton Corn Company?
Clinton Corn Processing Company.
I'm sorry.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
I got it.
You got it? Thank
Yeah,
you.
we're still recording.
Clinton Corn Processing Company had about 1,500 employees. It was the biggest employer in the area, and in those days, they were all men, with the exception of a few secretaries in the office. And men in those days earned $2.50 an hour, which was a good enough wage. It's $100 a week. It was a good enough wage to raise a family, a spouse that typically did not work, and a family of typically a couple of kids. $100 a week, very good jobs, and they had children, of course, those families, and they all took off. Not all of them, but they wanted their vacation in the summer when they were out of school, and so Clinton Corn's Processing Company hired a bunch of us kids out of college to work there in the summertime, when we were called extra board. Extra board is what we were. But what it really was is the worst jobs in the factory, because everybody else could bid up. And you know what I mean, to bid up to a better job in a place where you have a lot of working people. It's based on seniority. And the longer that you're there, the more seniority you have. And all the regular employees bid up to better jobs. And so the extra board always got the worst jobs in the factory. And so I did, along with, I don't know how many of us there were, but I'll bet there were 30 or 40 anyway, all summer long, covering men that had taken a vacation. They generally got a couple weeks vacation, and they took their families somewhere, and we covered them. And so we did some awful jobs. Turns out, of course, dangerous. Look how deaf I am. And some of that is from that, I'm sure. Probably the worst job there was something called pulling presses, where we separated gluten. We dried gluten into cakes. Gluten is the part of the corn, it's the protein, and it rots, and it was stinking, and it was hot, and you had these huge presses, probably 30 or 40 feet long, and probably a meter square, and they probably weighed over 100 pounds, each one of these presses, and they had nylon fillers on both sides of them. And they'd put the gluten that was in a slurry, that it says all water and gluten, into those presses, and then they'd press the presses, and then they'd put a lot of pressure on it, and they'd end up with a cake of pure gluten and get rid of most of the water. and then that would fall into a conveyor on the bottom underneath these presses, and there were probably, I don't know, a dozen or 15 of these presses. And mostly all of us kids we had to pull, you took a paddle and you put a paddle and a handle on each side of it. This is really crude. And pulled them about this far on each one of them, and then took our paddle and we'd scrape that cake down into that conveyor and move on to the next one. And you had to team them with the other person you were working with. And we worked 8 hours. We got a half-hour break, as I recall, in the middle of the time for lunch, we called it. Sat on the floor of the locker room and ate lunch. And the conditions weren't good. I mean, it was just full of flies, and but it wasn't food grade either. The gluten is the protein that is then at those times put back into made feed, animal feed is what it was for, along with some of the other products, the byproducts of the corn. That was one of the jobs. And, you know, one of the fellas, not one of my fellas, but a classmate of mine, slipped and fell and cut his leg off in the conveyor one time. These were tough conditions, but we were just doing what the other entry-level employees would do when you work in a factory. And then the next job that wasn't very good was called dumping carbon. And they had a large a building where at the refinery, you pulled presses at the feed house because they were making animal feed there. And the next bad job was dumping carbon. And you take carbon, you know, is used in filtration processes. And that was at the refinery where you refine sugar and sugar that would, corn sugar, of course, that would be both dried and liquid. And part of that refining process is using carbon. And so one person had to sit, and we worked shifts. The day shift was 7 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. The second shift was 3 to 11 at night, 3 in the afternoon to 11 at night. And the third shift was 11 at night till 7 in the morning. And we rotated every 2 weeks on our shifts. And the person that sat up there all night, we typically, well, it wasn't, you know, a third of the time was all night. And you stood up there and you dumped these bags of carbon down into this thing. And it was the filthiest, dirtiest job anybody could possibly do. And you got that carbon in all your pores. And you couldn't possibly wear a white shirt for days because it had all come out black. And all your T-shirts and your underwear, all was black. You couldn't get rid of it all. And we were, you know, anyway, that's what happens with carbon. It was powdered carbon. And by the way, dangerous because the damn stuff can blow up, you know, if you put a match to it. It's very, very explosive. And that was one of the bad jobs.
So, were you in any part of the union? When you were working in Clinton Corn Company, were you part of the union, or was your father part of the union?
Were either you or your father involved in the union while you worked there?
Oh no, my father was the chief chemical engineer, and he wouldn't be in the union. He was part of management.
So, can you tell us more about what he was doing and what was his job?
My father probably studied and purchased and designed and put in, and if he didn't do it himself, along with other engineers